Charles Fraser. The Turin Shroud. The Sherlock Holmes Easter Special, Episode 3. Based on the characters by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. A goaudio production. After we had overcome our initial shock, Holmes entered the chapel and knelt down beside the crucified Reverend Spina. I followed him hesitantly. Pastor Spina was naked. His modesty was covered by another burial shroud, which was most likely another forgery. The pastor's hands and legs were bound to the cross. His hands had not been pierced with nails. The dead man also lacked a crown of thorns. Nevertheless, Pastor Spina was dead. Instead of a spear tip protruding from his side, there was an ordinary kitchen knife in his body. On his bare chest, 4 letters were painted in blood, R-E-U-S, which in Latin meant guilty. The cause of death was the stab wound from the knife. Correct, Watson? Holmes asked me. Yes, I answered, swallowing audibly. I cannot detect any other injuries. However, depending on which organs were struck, it would have taken several minutes before death finally occurred. Doctor, would you mind taking off your jacket? Holmes said suddenly. I didn't know why, but I did as I was told and handed it to him. With a sudden movement, he pulled the burial shroud from the dead man's lap and immediately covered the private area again with my jacket. Holmes! I exclaimed indignantly. Holmes examined the cloth more closely, then handed it to the Cardinal, who was still cowering against the wall at the back, staring ahead pale as a ghost. Here, Cardinal, take the cloth. You must inform the police. I assume you don't want them to find this cloth. But you're removing vital evidence from a crime scene, I protested. The things one does for Holy Church, was Holmes's laconic reply. Then Holmes turned to Father Milani, who was crouching next to the Cardinal and, also paralysed with shock, was holding his hand. Go and inform the police about the murder. Meanwhile, we'll take care of Cardinal Fossati. Without a word, the young pastor rose on shaky legs and left the chapel. Then Holmes and I helped Cardinal Fossati back to his feet and supported him on both sides. Please take me back to my church. I want to pray, he said in a monotone voice. So we took the Cardinal back and seated him in the front pew. The Cardinal immediately fell to his knees, clasped his hands, bowed his head, and became absorbed in prayer. Holmes and I stayed for a while longer and watched over the Cardinal, just to make sure he wouldn't topple out of the pew. Come, Watson, let's go. I'd rather not encounter the police and have to answer their rudimentary questions. I raised no objection. I knew that contradicting Holmes was about as promising as trying to pee into the wind. We walked back to our boarding house in silence. Holmes muttered something about needing time to think quietly and disappeared into his room. I grabbed my little dog, who greeted me with a wagging tail, and went outside for some fresh air to clear my head. When I returned to the guest house after about an hour, I encountered an agitated Signora Leona. Her eyes were reddened, and one could tell she must have been crying. It's so dreadful, she sobbed. Good Pastor Spina dead. Who would do such a thing? She pulled a handkerchief from her apron and blew her nose noisily. Then she crumpled the handkerchief back up and let it disappear into her apron again. Did you hear anything, Doctor? People are saying the pastor was nailed to a cross, is that true? I patted her sturdy arm and said soothingly, No, that's not true. He wasn't nailed. However, I kept her in the dark about the precise circumstances. She began to weep again and whimpered. How dreadful! How could God allow such an abominable thing? I suddenly remembered the 4 letters that had been written on the vicar's chest. Reus, guilty. Perhaps our God was, in many ways, more just than I had previously assumed. I climbed the stairs to the first floor. My knee was hurting terribly. Although I had been walking a lot with sausages over the past few weeks, this running around that we were doing here in Turin far exceeded my usual habits. I had barely closed my bedroom door when there was a knock. I took a step back and opened it. It was Holmes. Please go back to Cardinal Fossati and obtain Pastor Milani's residential address from him. Also request his explicit discretion. I exhaled noisily. Couldn't you have thought of that earlier? Thank you, Watson. And, oh Watson, Please hurry and let me know straight away when you return." And just like that, Holmes had vanished. When I returned after about an hour, Holmes was already pacing impatiently up and down the corridor. "So there you are at last. Did you stop to pick a bouquet of flowers on the way?" I bit my tongue and swallowed the comment that was on the tip of my tongue. Instead, I handed him a note on which I had neatly written down Pastor Milani's address. "How was the Cardinal?" inquired Holmes. "As well as can be expected under the circumstances." I was just about to retire to my room, and, rightfully so, to lie down in my bed and give my battered limbs time to rest and recover, when I heard it echoing in my ears. "Come along, Watson. Why are you dawdling again?" "Can't you manage this without me?" I groaned. "Without you? Do you really think I brought you along merely for sightseeing? Pull yourself together. Why on earth had I come along? Here I was, having grown so old, and sadly not a jot wiser. So I gazed wistfully back at my room, yet followed Holmes closely at his heels. "Where are we actually going?" I asked Holmes after a while. "Naturally to the address that you so very swiftly procured for us." "Can we not take a taxi, or a carriage, a bicycle, a wheelchair, or whatever else?" "Holmes, I can't go on. My feet won't carry me another yard," I complained. "Stop whinging so much, Watson. We're nearly there." And indeed, after what felt like 100 kilometres, we finally reached our destination. But just as I thought my suffering had come to an end, I was once again proven wrong. Holmes forced me behind some prickly shrubbery. "We're taking up position," he called it. "Position for what?" I asked in my incredible naivety. "For the night, of course," he answered without beating about the bush. A sense of foreboding came over me. "But I'm already cold. If I still had my jacket that you've misappropriated, I'd certainly be warmer." I hissed at him angrily. "You're whinging again, Watson. Don't you even notice it anymore? Your jacket has served a good purpose. I'm sure you'll be rewarded in heaven for it some day." "Spare me your irony." An icy silence reigned for a while. "By the way, what's your theory about the letter's reuse written on Pastor Spina's chest?" I asked, breaking the silence. "Well, someone must believe that the pastor deserved to die like that," Holmes replied dryly. "Shouldn't we then investigate Spina's immediate circle? Given that the perpetrator must also be the thief of the burial shroud, and that, according to my deduction, only Pastor Spina or Pastor Milani could be responsible. I believe we're absolutely spot on here." We remained silent again for a while. Suddenly, something seemed to be happening. In the darkness, we could make out a figure heading straight towards the enormous estate. "Who's that?" I whispered to Holmes. "Judging by the gait, that must be Reverend Milani." The figure, whom we had both clearly identified as a man, paused for a moment in front of the gate's lantern. Holmes was right. It was Pastor Milani. He looked around in all directions, and it almost seemed as if he were waiting for someone. Shortly afterwards, the pastor appeared to have decided not to linger at the gate any longer. He opened it and disappeared behind it. "Where exactly are we?" I whispered to Holmes again. "This is Pastor Milani's family home. While you were getting the address, I made some inquiries about the pastor. His family is an ancient, deeply religious and obscenely wealthy noble family. His mother died long ago, and his father has also been bedridden for some time, presumably waiting for death's sweet release." Suddenly, another figure appeared in the light's glow. "Holmes, look, someone else is coming." I crouched even lower behind the bushes to ensure I wouldn't be discovered. The person was a young woman. She appeared mysterious and glanced around nervously. Then she opened the gate just a tiny crack, only wide enough for her to slip through. "Most interesting," Holmes murmured. "Can we finally leave now?" I asked expectantly. "What are you thinking? We must of course find out when the lady leaves the house again." "Oh yes, absolutely," I retorted sharply. Silence reigned once more. Why was the pastor tied to the cross? I mean, he wasn't nailed to it, so they could have saved themselves all that trouble. Or do you see a connection here that's meant to draw a parallel with Jesus Christ? That thought would be pure blasphemy. No, I believe someone simply wanted revenge on Pastor Spina. Whether the theft of the burial shroud was necessary for this remains to be seen. Perhaps the opportunity was simply convenient. And to give the whole thing the necessary attention, Good Friday and the cross were used quite theatrically. After all, to murder Pastor Spina with a knife wouldn't have required all of this. Perhaps with this staging, the murderer also wanted to tell us something that we haven't noticed yet. In the perpetrator's eyes, Pastor Spina was definitely guilty, and through this act, the whole world should know about it. Holmes paused briefly. The proper crucifixion was a common method of execution in ancient times, which was extremely painful and bloody, with the death throes lasting a very long time. The most famous example, besides Jesus Christ of course, was certainly Spartacus and his 6,000 slave followers. They were all executed along the Via Appia. Jesus, however, was a state criminal in the eyes of Prefect Pilate. Jesus had sought dominion over the Jews and thus challenged the authority of the Roman emperor. Through Jesus' demonstrative execution, they aimed to strike at the Jews' messianic expectations whilst deterring any potential insurgents. Jesus was first scourged with 40 lashes from a whip that had small bone and iron fragments attached to its ends. Afterwards, Jesus, bound to a crossbeam, was driven to Golgotha and nailed to a T-shaped cross. The nails were driven between the small bones of his wrists to prevent the palms from tearing between the fingers. His crossed legs could be secured with a nail through the instep. Death on the cross typically occurred through suffocation or circulatory collapse. Breaking the lower legs could hasten death. However, this method was not used on Jesus. Finally, Jesus died on the cross after a 3-hour death struggle. I let Holmes's account of Jesus' crucifixion properly sink in for the first time and allowed his words to affect me. The hours passed by. Dawn slowly began to break, and every few minutes my head would droop to my chest from sheer exhaustion, my eyes falling shut. Suddenly, Holmes jabbed me in the side. I looked up, startled. And indeed, there was movement at the gate. The young woman slipped back through the narrow gap onto the street. She looked around in all directions and pulled her hood deep over her face. Then she hastily disappeared down the street. "Shall we pursue her?" I asked drowsily. "Yes, we should. However, I must confess to my own regret that I'm too tired for that. And so are my old bones." A feeling of relief washed over me at Holmes's words. Nevertheless, I couldn't resist adding, "There you go moaning again, old friend." Around noon, loud knocking jolted me from my dreams. "That's far too early, Holmes," I shouted back at the knocking. "Come on, Watson, out of bed," echoed through the door. I took another deep breath and stretched thoroughly before peeling myself out of the cosily warming blanket and heaving my wrinkled, age-spotted legs out of bed. "Watson, what's keeping you?" I heard Holmes call impatiently once again. "Suffered under Pontius Pilate," shot through my mind, and instantly I knew exactly what the priest would say at my funeral. "Suffered under Sherlock Holmes!" I immediately felt ashamed of my blasphemous thoughts when it rang out again. "Watson!" I hurried to the door and opened it quickly before Holmes could threaten to break it down. "You're not even dressed yet," he scolded me. "I do apologise. In future, I shall sleep in my street clothes so as not to keep you waiting unnecessarily," I replied cynically. "I commend that, Watson. Very prudent of you. What torture do you have in store for me today?" "We shall, of course, pay Pastor Milani a visit. Furthermore, I would like to have a word with the Cardinal about the 3 burial shrouds." As Holmes informed me of his plans for the day, I was already dutifully getting dressed. "We can go, I'm ready." We found the pastor kneeling before the altar, deep in prayer. When he noticed us, he briefly looked up. Holmes and I waited patiently in the back until the pastor had finished his prayer. A few minutes later, the vicar rose, making the sign of the cross, and approached us. "I apologise for keeping you waiting." "But that's absolutely no problem at all," Holmes said kindly. "How are you today, after yesterday's dreadful events?" "When I think about it, I'm still shaking to my bones," he said, attempting to smile, though the smile never reached his eyes. "Shall we take a little stroll together?" Holmes asked the vicar. We left the building together and strolled across the lawn outside. What sort of man was Pastor Spina? How did you get on with him? Holmes inquired of the vicar. He didn't need long to think about it. Pastor Spina was a man of the church through and through. He lived by his own fanaticism. I respected him as a believer, but not as the head of a church. What do you mean by that? Asked Holmes, slightly irritated. Perhaps it's a mistake to tell you this, but for me, faith and the church are not one and the same. I am a very devout person and try, even though I may not always succeed, to live and strive accordingly. And that doesn't align with the institution of the church? Holmes probed. No, in my view it doesn't always do so. Holmes nodded approvingly and said, And yet you are a man of the church. First and foremost, I am a man of God. What does His Eminence the Cardinal think about that? Cardinal Fossati is a very warm-hearted person. Like me, he is a man of God. However, I don't believe the Cardinal distinguishes between God and the Church. For him, they are one and the same, and I must say, he does excellent work. How did the Cardinal feel about Pastor Spina? I asked. He already told you that. He was one of his closest confidants. Once the Cardinal takes someone into his heart, his eyes and his mind sometimes seem to fail him. That sounds very cryptic. What exactly do you mean by that? Holmes questioned. Quite simply, Pastor Spina and I were certainly not friends. We were colleagues. I didn't particularly think much of him as a person. And he was a religious fanatic, Holmes finished the sentence. That's right, the vicar agreed. And you probably won't reveal anything more about Pastor Spina, Holmes concluded. Milani laughed. And once again, you're right. Holmes abruptly changed the subject again. Were you able to sleep at all last night? He asked the young man sympathetically. As you can probably tell from looking at me, I've had better nights, admitted the pastor. Did you have any visitors last night? Pastor Milani looked at him indignantly. Holmes quickly said, I mean, were you perhaps able to unburden yourself about yesterday's events? No, I didn't have any visitors. I preferred to remain alone with God and my thoughts. We walked silently beside each other for a few more steps. It seemed as though each of us was lost in our own private thoughts. Suddenly, Holmes stopped and pulled a small water bottle from his coat pocket. I looked at him in surprise, but he merely said to Pastor Milani, At your age, it's simply very important to stay hydrated. Then he gave me one of those looks that said, Shut your mouth, Watson. Holmes took a few sips, but continued to hold his open bottle in front of him. Then we walked on. After just a few steps, Holmes appeared to stumble badly, spilling the remaining contents, as luck would have it, directly onto Pastor Milani. I rolled my eyes and had to briefly turn away to avoid giving away Holmes's performance. Holmes, on the other hand, was immediately at Pastor Milani's side, fiddling with his handkerchief around Milani's shirt and collar. All the while, he showered the pastor with apologies. How clumsy of me! What a blundering fool I am! My leg simply gave way, just buckled beneath me. Must be age catching up with me. Please forgive me. I'm terribly sorry. The unsuspecting young man endured it all with a smile. But Mr. Holmes, it was only water after all. Please, it's really not a problem at all. You'd better go and put on something dry now. We're finished here anyway. Thank you 1,000 times. With these words, Holmes simply sent the young pastor away. Holmes grinned. The young pastor may be a man of God, but he still lied. Yes, I know, I said, when he claimed he hadn't received any visitors yesterday. Holmes nodded. And that's not all. Our devout, or should I say credulous, vicar is having a love affair. My mouth fell open. I don't believe it, Holmes. Just because someone receives a lady visitor late at night doesn't automatically mean they're having an affair. Perhaps the young woman was a good old friend. And he lied for a good old friend. I might let you convince me of that, but how do you explain the telltale mark on his neck? You mean he had a love bite? That's outrageous, I scolded. He's a vicar. Are you quite sure? And being a pastor makes one infallible and free of all guilt? It's not that simple, Watson. And yes, I am quite certain. Why do you think I doused the poor fellow with water? Initially, I wanted to get him out of his shirt to check for possible scratch marks, but then I was satisfied enough with the rather surprising love bite. Come along, let's see if we can find the Cardinal. Let's hear what he has to say about his closest confidant's amorous activities. You want to go tell tales? I asked indignantly. Of course, Holmes grinned. We won't make any progress here otherwise. We finally found the pastor in the Shroud chapel. He simply stood still in front of the altar, looking as though he didn't want to be disturbed. Holmes, however, wasn't about to do him that favour. Cardinal Fossati, I do apologise for the interruption. Might we have a brief word with you? The Cardinal looked tired and aged by years. The recent events had taken their toll on him. Nevertheless, he received us graciously and kindly, just as one would expect from a cardinal. Have you discovered anything about the burial shrouds? I don't suppose you've been able to identify one of them as the original? Holmes immediately began his discourse. No, unfortunately not. All the cloths look completely identical, except, of course, for the various stains. The cloth that was used as a tablecloth has wine and food residue on it. The cloak is dirty, and the pastor's cloth is stained with blood, he replied, both sad and regretful. How do you intend to proceed? Tomorrow is Easter Sunday, and we haven't the faintest trace of the original cloth. Do you plan to clean one of the 3 cloths, whichever is least damaged, and display it tomorrow? I asked. I had already thought of that, admitted the Cardinal. However, that would be a lie and far too dangerous. Just imagine if the cloth were to surface somewhere in public and I had displayed a duplicate. Unthinkable. We agreed with the Cardinal. You could keep the chapel, and thus the cloth exhibition closed, out of respect for the deceased pastor due to ongoing police investigations. I'm sure a suitable explanation could be found. That would at least solve your problem for the remaining Easter holidays. The Cardinal gratefully agreed. That's a brilliant idea, Mr. Holmes. I thank you most sincerely. There's something else weighing on my mind, Your Eminence, said Holmes in an almost shy tone. The Cardinal looked at him in surprise. I hate to have to tell you this, but I believe Pastor Milani was having an affair. I watched the Cardinal intently, but nothing happened. The Cardinal merely smiled mildly and then said, You are a good detective, Mr. Holmes. Did you know that one of my hobbies is reading crime stories? Probably because of that, or because I'm not completely blind either, I am already aware of this circumstance. Now it was Holmes who seemed momentarily speechless with astonishment, but truly only for a moment. You know about this? The Cardinal laughed. But of course, those young lovebirds. How could I not have noticed? And you have no objection to that? I asked, perplexed. I do not see it as my duty to judge and pass sentence on this, especially since I generally always regard love as something precious and good. I also don't believe that our Jesus Christ would have had any objections to love. The 2 young people care for each other. What's wrong with that? The young lady sits in the front row during every service the pastor holds, gazing at him adoringly. As I observed just yesterday, Cardinal Fossati, I say this to you from the bottom of my heart. You are a true man of God to me, and I hold the utmost admiration for you. You have surprised me, and that happens extremely rarely, said Holmes, and I knew him too well to know that what he said was absolutely genuine. After our extremely interesting conversation with Cardinal Fossati, Holmes and I decided to get a bite to eat. We returned to the recommended restaurant and ordered pasta again. What can one say about that? I would have expected many reactions from the Cardinal, but certainly not that one, I said, still completely surprised. I feel exactly the same. I greatly admire Fossati's attitude, but from an investigative point of view, he's thrown me right back to square one. How so? I asked, taking a sip of my wine. I had considered Milani's girlfriend as a potential suspect, the theft of the shroud as an act of rebellion for their love. She would certainly have had the opportunity to get hold of Milani's keys. I'd also seen her as a possible perpetrator in Pastor Spina's case, perhaps because Spina had discovered their secret and was pressuring them both. It would have all fit together so well. Holmes sighed. Now we're back to square one. Thank goodness I already have an idea. I looked at him in bewilderment and asked, "And that would be?" "Tomorrow morning, before Easter Mass, I shall hear the confessions of the people of Turin." He beamed at me in joyful anticipation. You were listening to Charles Fraser, The Turin Shroud, the Sherlock Holmes Easter Special, Episode 3, based on the characters by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, a goaudio production.